Hi guys, and welcome to the Sysadmin Tutorials YouTube channel. Today we're going to be installing vSphere 6.7 into VMware Workstation. This video is designed for the beginner and will give you the ability to create a fully functional vSphere 6.7 environment on your home PC. Before we begin, there are some prerequisites. First, we'll need VMware Workstation. So you can get VMware Workstation by browsing to vmware.com products workstation-pro.html, and if you click on try workstation 15 pro download, you can get an evaluation copy. Then if you're happy with the product, you can go ahead and purchase it by clicking on the buy online button right here. Second, you'll want to have at least 16 gigabyte minimum of RAM on your home PC, as well as preferably an SSD drive. If you don't have an SSD drive, you can install on SATA, just the performance will be a little bit slower, actually much slower than what it would be on an SSD drive. So you're probably going to need around about 120 gig or so for ESXi and for vCenter server. And the third prerequisite is to download the ISO files for vCenter server and for ESXi. To do that, we can head on over to the evaluation page on vmware.com and we can click on download free trial next to VMware vSphere. When you click on this download free trial, it will open up another tab, and if you have a previous username and password for the VMware site, you can log in with that right here. Otherwise, if you're new to this site and you don't have a username and password, you can click on create an account, and that will then give you access to download the evaluation license and the ISO files. I've already downloaded them just to save time for this video, so this is pretty straightforward and it will give you a 60-day evaluation of the products. Now let's jump over to our lab design guide. So we have VMware Workstation, and within VMware Workstation I've already created a virtual machine called VMDC1. This is our Windows Active Directory domain controller, and it's going to be responsible for DNS and NTP time synchronization. So that one you can see over here on the left, it's called VMDC1. And the second virtual machine that we're going to be creating in this lab is called VM ESXi1. So that's our ESXi 6.7 host. Once we've created that host, we're then going to log in, have a look around, and we're then going to install our vCenter virtual machine. So the vCenter virtual machine is going to be sitting inside our ESXi host. So now that we have the lab design here, we're going to start to create our VM ESXi1 host. To do that, we're going to head on over to the File menu in VMware Workstation. We'll click on New Virtual Machine, and I'm running Workstation 14. So if you download the latest version, I believe it's at Workstation 15. I'm going to leave it on Custom Advanced and click on Next. The hardware compatibility I'll leave on Workstation 14.x. However, you may have Workstation 15.x if you're running the latest version. So I'll click on Next. And now I'm going to be clicking on Installer Disk Image. On Installer Disk Image file, make sure that you have your ESXi ISO file selected here. So you can just click on Browse. Browse to where the file is, click on it, and it will then populate this field. So I have that here, and you can see the version and build number that I'm running. So we'll click on Next. And here we'll click on VMware ESX. And for the version, we'll just make sure that we're on ESXi 6.5 and later. We'll click Next. Now I'm going to select a location where we'll be saving our virtual machine files. And this is a location on my SSD drive. We'll then give our virtual machine a name, and the virtual machine name will be VM ESXi1. I'll click Next. And for the number of processors, I'm going to be selecting 4. My home PC has 4 cores, 8 hyper-threaded. So I'm just going to select 4 processors here, and we'll click on Next. Now for the memory, I'm going to give it 12 gigabytes of RAM. And you're going to see why we need 12 gigabytes of RAM a little bit later on when it comes time to deploy the vCenter server. Now 12 gigabytes of RAM in megabytes is 12288. And the way that I came to that number is you simply multiply 12 by 1024, and that will give you 12288. All right, so we'll click on next. And for the networking type, I'm going to be selecting bridged networking. So this is going to allow me to go straight onto my home network. And my home network is using a subnet of 192.168.1.0/24. The other alternative, you can use network address translation, NAT. And what this means is that you'll be pretty much hiding behind the IP address of your home PC or wherever you have your VMware Workstation installed. So I'm going to be keeping this simple. I'll select use bridge networking and we'll click on next. For the I/O controller type, I'm going to go with the VMware Workstation recommendation. So we'll leave paravirtualized SCSI enabled here. And again, for the disk type, we'll go with the recommendation from Workstation. We'll leave SCSI selected and we'll click on next. For the virtual machine disk file, we'll create a new virtual disk. And we'll give the size of the virtual disk as 60 gig. And we'll select here store virtual disk as a single file. I don't really want them as multiple files. And we don't want to select allocate all disk space now. So we want it to be thin provisioned. We'll click on next. This is going to be the name of the disk file that's sitting on our SSD drive. And it's a 60 gig disk file. But because we're not allocating it all up front, it's only going to be using a fraction of the 60 gig. So we'll click on next. And here's a summary of all of our settings that we've entered in so far. If you're happy with that, we'll click on finish and the virtual machine will be deployed. And our virtual machine is deployed over here on the left side. So I'm going to just drag that up into my vSphere 6.7 lab folder. And what I'll do is I'm going to right click on the virtual machine, go to power and select startup guest. And we're presented with the ESXi installer here. I'm just going to press enter. Okay, I'm going to go through the installation quite quickly. The reason for that is that I've already have a ESXi 6.7 install video on my YouTube channel. And if you haven't installed ESXi before, if you're quite new to this, then I highly recommend you go and check that video out. It will go through much more settings and much more configuration options than what we're going to go through in this video. But if you follow me on screen here, we'll be able to get our ESXi up and running, and then we're going to be moving along to installing our vCenter server as a virtual machine. So now we'll click on enter. And we'll press F11 to accept the user license agreement. All right, this is our 60 gig drive that we've provisioned. So I'm going to be installing ESXi on that. So I'll press enter. And our keyboard layout, we'll leave it as US default. Now we'll type in the ESXi root password and we'll press enter. And the installer is now ready to install. So we'll press on F11 and the install will begin. All right, the installation has complete, so we'll press enter and our ESXi VM will reboot. Okay, our ESXi host has now rebooted, and as you can see on screen, it's obtained an IP address from my home network DHCP server, and that's okay. We're going to go in and change that now. So we'll press F2, and I'll type in the root password. And we'll go down to Configure Management Network. Go down to IPv4 configuration and we'll select set static IPv4 address, and the IP address that we have assigned for our ESXi server is 192.168.1.201. So I'll enter that in there, and our subnet mask is correct, 255.255.255.0, and our default gateway is 192.168.1.1, which is my home router. So I'll press enter. And we'll go down to IPv6 configuration. I'm going to disable this and press enter. And now we'll go into DNS configuration. We're going to specify our DNS servers, so I'll select use the following DNS server addresses and host name. For our primary DNS server is our Windows Active Directory domain controller, and that has an IP address of 192.168.1.210. We don't have an alternate DNS server, so I'll leave that. For our host name, I'm going to be typing in VM ESXi1, and then followed by the Active Directory DNS. So that's vSphere 6.7 lab.local. and we'll press enter. For custom DNS suffixes, I'll also enter in vSphere 6.7 lab.local, which is my Active Directory domain. And press enter. And now I'm going to press escape. It's going to apply the settings and then reboot the ESXi host, at which we can then log into the graphical user interface. So apply changes and reboot the host. Y for yes. A restart is in progress. Okay, our ESXi host is now up. So what we'll do is we'll go across to our Active Directory domain controller and we'll just minimize Chrome. We'll open up the command prompt and we'll just try to ping our ESXi server to verify network connectivity. And we can ping our ESXi server, which is good. I'm going to open up a new Chrome. And in here, I'm going to browse to HTTPS and then the IP address of our ESXi server. I'll accept the certificate by clicking Advanced and Proceed. And here we'll log in with the username root and our password that we specified in the ESXi installer. Optionally, you can leave this ticked, which will join the VMware Customer Experience Improvement Program. But for this lab, I'm just going to untick it and click OK. So now we're logged into our VMware ESXi host. So this is all up and running now. Our next step is going to be deploying our vCenter server into this ESXi host. Now to do that, we need to go over to where we've downloaded our vCenter ISO file and right click on that ISO file and select Mount. Within here, we'll click on VCSA UI Installer, Win32, and down at Installer here, we'll right click that. Actually, we'll first select it and then right click it and select Run as Administrator. Say yes here. Okay, the vCenter Server Appliance installer has now come up on screen. So the option that we want to be selecting here is Install. So we'll click on that. And this is broken up into two stages. I'm going to go through this one also quite quickly, but I do have a vCenter 6.7 installation video that covers the installation, all the settings within vCenter, how to deploy it, and so on and so on. So I highly recommend that you go and check that video out as well if you've never deployed vCenter Server Appliance before. So back in this wizard, we're going to click on Next. We'll accept the license agreement. And we're just going to deploy a vCenter server with an embedded platform services controller. So that's the default option here. The ESXi host or vCenter server name. In this field, we're going to be typing in the IP address of our ESXi host that we just deployed. And we'll leave the HTTPS port as 443. And for the username, we'll type in root and our root password for the ESXi host. We'll click Next. We'll accept the certificate. And for our virtual machine name for our vCenter server, we're just going to type in VM vCenter. And we'll set the root password for the vCenter appliance. And we'll click on Next. And here we select our deployment size. So by default, it's on Tiny. And as you can see, the Tiny deployment size uses 2 vCPUs and 10 gig of memory. So that's why we needed to allocate 12 gig of memory to our ESXi server. And then we'll leave about 1 or 2 for a Linux virtual machine later on. But if you want to select a larger deployment size, you can see that the vCPU size and the memory size and even the storage increases. So it gives you a rough indication there. So for the Tiny deployment size, you can have 10 hosts or up to 100 and up to 100 virtual machines. And then all the way up to the extra large one, which goes to quite a large number of hosts and virtual machines. So I'll be leaving mine on Tiny and we'll click on Next. Now this data store number 1 is the data store within ESXi server. So that's the only one I can select. So that's where I'm going to be deploying my virtual center server appliance. And I'm going to click on Enable Thin Disk Mode as well. So it doesn't provision all the storage up front. So I'll click Next. For the networking, we're going to be selecting VM Network. So VM Network is the default network name within ESXi after the installation has finished. And this network is going to put me straight onto my home PC network, and that's the 192.168.1.x subnet. For IP version, we'll leave that as IPv4, and the assignment will be static, and the fully qualified domain name of our vCenter server appliance is going to be vMVCenter.vSphere 6.7 lab.local. And this is quite important, and I'm going to show you why in just a second, but we'll just finish filling out the rest of these fields. So the IP address for my vCenter server is going to be 192.168.1.205, and the subnet mask will be 255.255.255.0, and default gateway will be 192.168.1.1. Our DNS server is our Windows Active Directory domain controller, and if we scroll down, there's no more settings. We'll leave the common ports as default. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to go into the DNS configuration in our Active Directory domain controller, and we're going to set up a forward and reverse lookup for this fully qualified domain name. And the reason why we need that is that during the vCenter server appliance installer, it does try to do a forward and reverse lookup of this name. And if it is not successful, the installer does fail. So we'll go across over to our DNS manager. And within DNS manager, the first thing that you'll want to do, if you haven't already done it so far, is go to reverse lookup zones, right click, select new zone, and we're going to create a reverse lookup zone for 192.168.1.0. So we'll leave primary zone selected, we'll leave this default, we'll leave this one as default as well, and IPv4 reverse lookup zones correct. So for the network ID, we'll type in 192.168.1 and we'll click on next. We'll allow only secure dynamic updates, that's fine. Click on next and we'll click on finish. So we've set up our reverse lookup zone, and now we'll go to forward lookup zones. We'll go to vSphere 6.7 lab.local, and we'll right click and create a new host record. So the host record name will be vMVCenter, and the IP address will be the IP address of our vCenter server. Make sure that you have create associated pointer record on, because that will create the reverse lookup. And we'll click on add host. Click OK. And then I'm also going to be creating a host record for our ESXi server. So our ESXi server name is VM ESXi1, and I'll type in the IP address 192.168.1.201. Create associated pointer record is selected, and we'll click add host. Okay, and done. And let's minimize the DNS manager now. So back on our vCenter server appliance wizard, we'll click on next. And here we have a summary of all of our settings that we've entered in so far. If you're happy with that, we'll click on finish and we'll complete stage 1 of the vCenter server install. Now this is going to take a little bit of time, so what I'm going to do is just pause the video and wait until this completes, and then once it's completed, I will resume the video. Okay, stage 1 is now complete, so we're going to go ahead and click on continue. And we're now ready for stage 2, which is the setup of the vCenter server appliance. So we'll click on next. And for time synchronization mode, we'll drop that down. We'll select synchronize time with NTP servers, and we'll type in the IP address of our Active Directory domain controller. We'll leave SSH disabled for now, and we'll click on next. For the SSO domain, we'll type in vSphere.local, and then we'll set the administrator password. Scroll down, there's nothing else there to configure, so we'll click on next. I'll unselect the customer experience program and click next. And we'll just verify that our settings are all correct, and if they are, we'll click on finish to complete stage 2. So a warning pops up, you will not be able to pause or stop the install from completing once it's started. So we're okay with that, we'll click OK and we'll continue. Now during the appliance setup, it also takes quite a lot of time to complete that. So what I might do is just pause the video and then return once it's complete. Okay, stage 2 is now complete. So we'll click on, actually before we click on close, this is our URL that we'll be typing in to get to the web user interface for vCenter. So just keep that one in mind. We'll click on close. Okay, and the tab opens up automatically to browse to the user interface for vCenter. So we'll click advanced, I'll click proceed. And here we have two options. We can either launch the vCenter HTML5 interface or the older Flex interface. So what we'll do is we'll launch the HTML5 interface. That's the new one that has been available with vSphere 6.5 and has enhanced quite a lot for 6.7. And if you remember, during the setup, we created a username called administrator, and our SSO domain was vSphere.local. So we'll use that as our username to log in with. So we'll type administrator and then @vSphere.local. And we'll type in our password. And here we are inside the vCenter 6.7 web user interface. So we're just going to do a few more things before we wrap up this tutorial. So I'm just going to expand this window here on the left. And on VM vCenter.vSphere 6.7 lab.local, I'm going to right click and I'm going to select new data center. And for my data center name, I'm just going to type in vSphere 6.7 lab. Okay, and then under vSphere 6.7 lab data center, we'll right click and we'll select add host. So now I'm going to be adding in the ESXi host that we created earlier. So remember, this vCenter server is sitting within that ESXi host, and I'm going to be showing you that shortly. So for the host name, which is what we want to use, we don't want to use the IP address because it'll just come up much neater. We'll type in VM ESXi1.vSphere 6.7 lab.local and we'll click next. For the username, we'll type root and the root password. We'll accept the ESXi server certificate. And that's a host summary of the ESXi host. So we'll click next. And we'll just be assigning it the evaluation license. Remember, the evaluation license expires after 60 days. So we'll click next. For lockdown mode, we'll just leave that on disabled for now, and we'll go next. And for VM location, we'll just select the vSphere 6.7 lab data center object here on the right, and we'll click next. And there's a summary of your settings, and we'll click finish. Now, if we expand our data center object, we'll see our ESXi host. We can see by the summary tab that the hypervisor is VMware ESXi 6.7 along with the build version. And if we expand the host, we will see our VM vCenter running. So a few things moving forward from here. If you right click on the data center object, you can create a new cluster. And depending on your home PC, how much RAM it has, how many cores it has, you can create a second ESXi host and then add those two hosts into the cluster and simulate some failovers and play around with things like that, and also with HA. The other thing you can do is just go ahead and create some more virtual machines by right clicking on the host and selecting new virtual machine and following this wizard here. Okay, that completes this installation of vSphere 6.7 within VMware Workstation. Just a reminder to also check out my ESXi 6.7 installation video and also my vCenter 6.7 installation video, which you can find within my channel. If you have any questions in regards to this install, or if you're curious about learning other things, please leave a comment below. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.